The title of my talk is Abortion versus Childbirth, the Latest Evidence on Psychological Risk. And I'm going to address 4 basic questions. I hope I don't bore you too much. There are numbers, there's a lot of research within the slides, but I also have the human side, and so I have stories that will be part of the discussion tonight. The questions are, what risk factors for post-abortion mental health problems are the most well-established in the world literatures? What specific negative psychological outcomes have the most empirical support in the world literatures? How might psychological effects differ with chemical abortion versus surgical abortion? The beginning research on this topic is demonstrating that chemical abortion is potentially more traumatizing even than surgical, and we'll talk about why. Is there evidence that childbirth is psychologically safer than abortion? So we'll look at that literature as well. And I like to begin with part of a Hemingway short story that not many people have probably heard about. My dad was an English teacher and kind of pushing all kinds of authors down our throats for years. So for many years I wasn't really interested in literature, but I'm finding how amazingly relevant stories from so long ago are today. So back in the early 20th century, abortion was not condoned as it is today, and the reality of abortion was not hidden by the massive deception that characterizes contemporary life. Take, for example, the woman in Hemingway's short story, Hills Like White Elephants, which was published in 1927. The story is mostly a dialogue between a young man and woman awaiting a train in Spain. As they converse, it becomes clear that the topic is whether or not the woman should have an abortion. The man, who is apparently the father, wants her to have one, assuring her that it is awfully simple, not really an operation at all, perfectly natural. The woman is utterly unconvinced. Far away beyond the river were mountains. The shadows of a cloud moved across the field of grain, and she saw the river through the trees. And we could have all this, she said, and we could have everything, and every day we make it more impossible. We can't have everything, he insists. No, we can't. It isn't ours anymore, and once they take it away, you never get it back. So the world literature on abortion and women's mental health has grown considerably over the past few decades, and the scientific rigor of the published studies has increased substantially. The focus of the body of research that is available is, there are actually sort of 2 types of research out there. A body of studies that look at risk factors, looking at what are the characteristics of women who are more vulnerable afterwards in terms of experiencing the abortion as a trauma. So basically, who's at risk? What are the demographic, social, relationship type factors that make women more prone to psychological problems afterwards? And then what is the frequency of various outcomes or psychological problems? So we'll look at both sides. Beginning with women at risk, I recently conducted a search of literature from 1972 to 2011. The initial purpose of this search was for work that I've been doing with South Dakota, where we actually have been able to successfully, I'm not the lawyer, far from it, but Harold Cassidy, who was the litigator, he was an intervener in this case, was able to successfully litigate inclusion of risk factors into a law. So now women in South Dakota have to be appraised of and counseled for certain risk factors. But the initial footwork on this was to just look at the literature, see what was out there, and identify how many studies there are on each of the different factors. And I elicited the help of my son, who is a biology master's student, who is now studying schooling behavior in fish, and will have nothing to do with any of my work, but at that time he was desperate for cash, and he helped me identify many, many studies, and so I have to give Joey a little bit of credit here too. So what are the most well-established risk factors in the literature? If the woman is pressured or coerced, there are 13 studies documenting this risk factor, and really this is a variable that is on a continuum. It could be very slight pressure, just feeling like a partner or a parent would prefer the woman to have an abortion, all the way up to like threats of death if the woman doesn't go through with the abortion. And in the U.S., there are many cases of women who have been killed by partners for refusing to have an abortion. So the coercion variable is an important one. Also, if she's religious or views an abortion to be in conflict with her personal values, 10 studies. If the pregnant woman was ambivalent about the abortion, experienced decision difficulty, or had a high degree of decisional distress, 21 studies. She was committed to the pregnancy or preferred to carry the child to term, 7 studies. Belief that abortion terminates the life of a human being and or the woman experienced bonding to the fetus, 6 studies. And actually, the percentage of women who believe that women who are about to undergo an abortion, when polled, between 25 and 50% of them believe that they are terminating the life of a human being, yet they go through with it. And there are different ways of trying to understand that psychologically, but for a lot of women, they probably feel like it's my life versus this child's life, so it's almost like a self-defense type reaction. But it's not true that that all women who undergo an abortion don't understand that they're terminating a life. Many do. She had a pre-abortion mental health or psychiatric problem, 31 studies. And this is an important risk factor because you'll often hear from researchers who are oriented to the pro-choice position, they often will say that the average woman who goes in for an abortion is not going to have psychological problems. It's only these psychologically vulnerable women who already were depressed or already had some pre-existing psych problem, and they're the ones who are going to be harmed by an abortion. Well, it is true that they are psychologically more vulnerable, and it is a risk factor. So if somebody has prior depression or substance abuse problems or whatever, they're going to require more sensitive counseling, and they are more likely to have a problem afterwards. However, we've now conducted many studies where we've controlled for prior psych history, and we've been able to tease out an independent effect of abortion. So it is not just women who have had prior psychological problems, yet they are a high-risk group. The pregnant woman was an adolescent or young adult. And this makes sense because a lot of adolescents who choose to terminate a pregnancy do so because a parent has encouraged that or a partner, and often these decisions are not their own at that stage in life. She was in a conflicted, unsupportive relationship with the father of the child, 24 studies. The pregnant woman experienced negative relationships with others, 28 studies. She had character traits suggesting emotional immaturity, instability, or difficulty coping. 42 studies document this risk factor. Indicators of poor quality abortion care, feeling misinformed, inadequate counseling, negative perceptions of staff, etc. 10 studies. And many of the factors that I've just listed and others that I haven't covered are complexly interconnected. And this interconnectedness is exemplified in a testimony that I'm going to read. So it's important to realize that, a woman might be undecided about the decision, and then she might also be pressured, and she might also be young, and she might not, so many women have overlapping risk factors, which just heightens that risk. So this testimony that I actually found on a site called the Experience Project, and it's not a site that is specifically devoted to abortion stories or reproductive health. It's just kind of a site where people from all walks of life connect and support each other through their stories. So this was posted by a woman by the name of Claire. And she said, I found out I was pregnant at 23 in February 2011. I was in a stable, happy relationship with a good job. I was so excited, I told my friends and partner, who were also thrilled. My mom found out and started talking about finances, work, etc. After my first scan, I went to surprise her with the photo. She tried to hide it and told me to put it away so no one could see. It felt like my baby was unwelcome. I realized how embarrassed she was of me, so I told myself that an abortion was the solution. On the morning of the operation at 12 weeks, the doctor gave me a scan, and unfortunately I saw the screen, which is the image now stuck in my head every day. For the past year, I've cried every day and find it difficult to look at a baby or a pregnant woman without my eyes filling up. It feels like my stomach twists and something hurts inside. As for the really crazy part, I did a pregnancy test every week after the abortion for nearly 8 months in hopes it would be positive, even though I knew it was impossible. If nothing else, I hope this makes others who have had an abortion realize that they're not on their own, and to those thinking about it, I would say if there's a part of you that wants to keep the baby, this is not an option. So 40 years of research has shown that when specific physical, psychological, demographic, and situational factors are operative in women's lives, they are at a significantly increased risk of experiencing mental health problems following abortion. Even several abortion doctors agree on the risk factors. Back in 1995, Baker stated in a textbook, in the cases where women do react negatively after an abortion, there appear to be predisposing factors linked to those reactions. There's enough valid research from which we can attempt to assess a client's potential for negative reactions after an abortion. And Baker recommends identifying these predisposing factors before an abortion. Belief that abortion is murder, low self-esteem, ambivalence about the decision, intense guilt and shame about the abortion, perceived coercion to have an abortion, and commitment to the pregnancy. The American Psychological Association, I'm not a fan of this organization. I actually was a reviewer for their document that was published in 2008. They sent it to me and 19 other reviewers. I received the document in 2007, and I was getting on the plane to Portugal, and I thought, maybe I shouldn't open this on the plane because I could have a heart attack, and then I will have no help available to me on this plane to Portugal. But then I got brave, and I opened it anyway, and I nearly had a heart attack because they had left out like 50 studies, European studies. They had a crafty way of selecting studies so they could eliminate a good chunk of them that showed adverse effects. So although I find the final report, they really just didn't pay much attention to the feedback either from any of the reviewers. We got to correspond. Dr. Ferguson from New Zealand was also a reviewer, and we've corresponded. We wrote a petition letter. We've tried everything. But when it comes to risk factors, so I don't agree with their conclusions on the outcomes, their bottom line conclusion that they derived from one study that was originated in England in '95. I don't, but they were unable to, as much as they contorted the literature, they were unable to deny that there are risk factors. So even the APA is with us on these risk factors, and in their 2008 report, they noted that if the pregnancy was wanted or meaningful to the woman, if she was pressured from others, if there's opposition to the abortion from partners, family, or friends, if there's a lack of social support, commitment to the pregnancy, ambivalence about the decision, or low perceived ability to cope, that if these variables, if these factors are present in a woman's life, she's more likely to have problems afterwards. So the abortion providers, the published research, the professional organizations, there's really no debate on these risk factors. Yet, despite the availability of strong research documenting risk factors and professional awareness, abortion providers rarely, if ever, unless it's mandated by a state like it is in some states in the U.S., providers rarely, if ever, routinely screen for risk factors and counsel women at risk. So now we'll kind of shift focus here and look at the psychological consequences, the research that examines outcomes. And there is an abundant literature comprised of methodologically sophisticated studies from around the world that now indicates abortion significantly increases risk for the following problems: depression, anxiety of various forms, substance abuse, suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And there are other outcomes. There are a few studies that have looked at like sleep problems, eating disorders, but these are the categories of the disorders that have the most peer-reviewed support. So I would say, based on my assessment of the literature and kind of referencing other people who have surveyed the literature, that a minimum of 20% of women who abort suffer serious, prolonged negative psychological consequences. Abortion is further associated with a higher risk for negative psychological outcomes when compared to unintended pregnancy carried to term. And there are at least 8 studies that have unintended pregnancy as the control group. I'm working on a study now where we've been actively collecting data, and the control group that we're using is women who have an unintended pregnancy and actually went to an abortion facility to seek an abortion and changed their mind, so that demographically, socially, and in other ways, these women will be as comparable to women who actually abort as we can possibly get. So, but there are more studies that look at unintended pregnancy. And the data indicate that risk for long-term psychological injury is considerably higher with abortion than with other forms of perinatal loss. Abortion-related psychological problems may also increase a person's chance of engaging in self-harm, even if not motivated consciously by suicide thoughts, and of becoming a victim of an accident or violence. And this is the study that I just mentioned a minute ago, but we are currently conducting a national study in the U.S., and some of the items have relevance to our topic today. I'm not looking at that comparison group now, but the larger group, and we have close to 1,100 women have completed this 400-item survey, thanks in large part to CareNet directors throughout the U.S. who have sent alerts about the availability of the study and have begged people to participate. But here are some of the items. This is just a preliminary analysis. In response to the item, because of the abortion, I stopped taking good care of myself. 42% agreed or strongly agreed, and among these women who agreed, 73% noted that it lasted 3 years or more. In response to the item, I tended to take greater risks after the abortion because my personal safety was less important to me. 48% agreed or strongly agreed. And then among those that agreed, 72% indicated that it lasted 3 years or more. In response to the item, I drank alcohol excessively as a result of my abortion. 30% agreed or strongly agreed. Among these women who agreed, for 57%, it lasted 3 years or more. With regard to the item, I used illegal drugs following the abortion because of the distress it caused me. 19% agreed or strongly agreed, and among these women who agreed, 71% said it lasted 3 years or more. In response to the item, I relied on alcohol and/or drugs to escape troubling post-abortion emotions. 48%, almost half of them, agreed or strongly agreed, and it persisted for 3 years or more, and 56%. In response to the item, life felt like it wasn't worth living because of the abortion. 44% agreed or strongly agreed. Among these women who agreed, for 63%, it lasted 3 years or more. With regard to the item, I thought about taking my life because I had the abortion. 33%, a third of the women agreed or strongly agreed. And among these women who agreed, for 32%, it lasted 3 years or more. In response to the item, I made realistic attempts to take my life because of the abortion. 11% agreed or strongly agreed. And among these women who agreed, the feelings of suicidal feelings lasted, for 25%, it lasted 3 years or more. And then I just want to just share some of women's own stories from our data collection effort. So when asked what was the hardest thing about the abortion, this is what we heard. The abortionist never spoke a word to me. It was though we were not even human. The only words I ever heard from him were these, quote, "I think that was the biggest one we've ever done." The whole thing was absolutely shocking and painful in so many ways. I had to numb myself after the fact. I tried so hard to pretend it never happened. The father and I had a pact that we would never speak of it again. We kept the pact for 18 years, but the consequences were deadening. Another woman said, "I had to shut down my emotions completely. Only a few short years before I longed for and dreamt of being on my own and having a child, someone I could love and cherish after all the abusive people in my life. The abortion experience made me believe that I was unworthy of ever having a child. I was overcome by an incredible amount of self-loathing and sank into a deep depression that lasted for years. Almost immediately after the abortion, I developed an infection and secretly wished I would die from it. I was prescribed an antibiotic and I survived. The hardest part," another woman said, "the hardest part is reliving it. I woke up during the procedure, so to this day, on random days, I remember the loud vacuum-like sounds and grotesque sucking pressure on my insides. This memory replays itself in my head over and over to the point of near vomit. The feeling of loss, I long for my baby, and through the act of abortion, I did something that is completely irreversible." So when we look at what are the strengths of the studies published in the last 10 years, we do have much larger samples. Many are nationally representative. Many of the studies have controls for prior psychological history, controls for personal and situational variables that are associated with the choice to abort. We also have much longer-term data collection with low dropout rates. The studies that were published by David Ferguson in 2006 and 2008 cover a period of 25 years, and he was able to retain, I think it's 80 to 85% of the sample over that time period. That was simply not true with the studies that Planned Parenthood still relies on in terms of their efforts to inform women. There were dropout rates of like 60% in some of those studies published in the 80s, and so the retention was bad, and the time frame, that's okay, I think I'm okay. The time frame was typically only a few weeks after the procedure rather than following the women for years, as we now have many studies that follow women for many years. We also now have the appropriate comparison groups, the unintended pregnancy or other forms of perinatal loss, and we have much more comprehensive measures of mental health. A lot of those early studies, women were just asked, things like, one item, have you been more depressed since your abortion? Have you been more anxious? Well, that's good to know, and it's coming straight from the woman, but it's not really a valid measure of mental health. We need multi-item scales, we need professionals diagnosing, and so a lot of the studies today actually have diagnostic codes that were assigned by trained professionals. So we're getting much better measures of the mental health. So here are a few recent studies from around the globe. In France, Rousset and colleagues in 2011 conducted a study of 86 women who had a surgical abortion or a chemical abortion at family planning centers and general hospitals in southern France. At 6 weeks post-abortion, 20% had scores indicating acute stress, and 38% had scores indicating actual PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Bereavement, grief, and PTSD scores were higher among women with a chemical abortion compared to a surgical abortion, and the researchers concluded, quote, "These results evidence the complexity of coping with an abortion and emphasize the need to develop specific support as well as preventive strategies." And these results were consistent with earlier studies. Slade and colleagues in '98 found that compared to those who had surgical abortions, those who had chemical abortions rated it as more stressful and experienced more disruption in their lives. Ashok and colleagues in 2005 reported 47% of women undergoing a chemical abortion experienced a significant decline in self-esteem 2 to 3 weeks following the abortion. And this was a higher percentage than among those with the surgical. It was 39%. Again, another study by Kelly and colleagues, they reported that women who underwent chemical abortion had higher PTSD intrusion scores, which included nightmares, unwanted thoughts, and images than women who had surgical abortions. 47% of women who underwent chemical abortions indicated they would not choose the method again. 53% felt the procedure was worse than expected. So why might we expect the psychological trauma to be greater with chemical abortion compared to surgical? Well, there are a number of possible reasons. One might be the participatory role of the woman. The woman's directly responsible for the abortion, and this may exacerbate guilt and other negative self-directed thoughts and feelings. Guilt tends to be very high with women. We did a cross-cultural study that was published in 2004 in the Medical Science Monitor, and we found that Russian women living in a culture where there's not a lot of resistance to abortion. At one point in Russian history, it was like normative birth control, yet 49% reported feeling guilt associated with the abortion. So guilt tends to be high, and then it can be with surgical, and it's even worse with the chemical. Also, medical abortion requires the woman to be more alert and involved during the process, making it impossible for her to distance psychologically from what's happening. Also, the woman may see the expelled fetus. As a participant in a study by Halden and colleagues in 2008 explained, you really take your child's life. I think if you see it, then you see that you really do take the life of your child. Another reason, the woman is more likely alone and without emotional support at the time of the abortion. And the home generally, or the bathroom in particular, may become associated with the abortion, so one's home may become a trigger for uncomfortable emotions as opposed to a refuge. As researchers Slade and colleagues in '98 noted, one of the main differences between these two methods of termination is the consciousness and participation of the patient in the medical procedure in a process that involves blood, pain, and death. Another recent study was published in 2012 in China, and the sample had nearly 7,000 women. 3,264, or 48% of whom had experienced at least one abortion. Women with a history of induced abortion a year or more prior were 49% more likely to experience depression, 114% more likely to experience anxiety in the first trimester of a later pregnancy compared to women who had not experienced an abortion after controls for maternal education, income, place of residence, and BMI were applied. There were no differences between women with and without a history of spontaneous abortion or miscarriage. So I'd like to share a little bit about the meta-analysis that I published in 2011, and I identified the strongest studies that were published between 95 and 2009, and they are synthesized in this report. I chose 1995 because that was kind of the mid-90s was when we really saw kind of a change in the methodological rigor of studies being published. Prior to that, there were all kinds of methodological issues with what had come out in the literature. So I looked at that 15-year time period. And just to kind of explain what a meta-analysis is, it's distinct from a narrative review or a qualitative review of the literature because there's a quantitative measurable component. And so by systematically combining the numerical results from many high-quality studies that address the same basic question, is there an association between abortion and mental health, very reliable results are produced. Studies are weighted statistically, and meta-analysis offers a logical, more objective alternative to these traditional or qualitative reviews. And it's interesting when you think about the fact that the American Psychological Association or the Royal College of Psychiatrists more recently, in their reviews of all the literature, they don't conduct a meta-analysis. Well, I can't imagine that no one had the expertise. It's not very hard. You buy the software and you put the numbers in. It's not really, technically, it's not difficult to conduct a meta-analysis, but they didn't do that. If they had done that, of course, the bottom line conclusion would be different from what it was, because the numbers don't lie, and when you compare the effects across studies, it shows pretty clearly that abortion places women at risk. And so and a meta-analysis is only as good as the studies that go into it. So it's very important that you have rigorous criteria for selecting those studies. I think in one of the letters that was sent to the British Journal, one of the attacks was, well, she just put her own studies in there. Of course, why, but 11 of them I was an author or co-author out of 22, but I wasn't going to knock my studies out. They met criteria, and so every single study published during that window of time from 95 to 2009 is in the meta-analysis, regardless of who did it. And many people have tried to find a study that I missed that should have been included, and they haven't found any. There aren't any studies that were ignored, and if they met these criteria. So there had to be at least 100 in the sample. There had to be a comparison group. No abortion, pregnancy delivered, or unintended pregnancy delivered. One or more mental health outcome variables in those categories of depression, anxiety, alcohol use, marijuana use, and suicidal behaviors. And all of this, I only included studies that had controls for third variables as well. And then the basic result there, and I did 3 different analyses, and I'll explain them, but the first meta-analysis included 36 adjusted odds ratios derived from those 22 studies, and it resulted in a pooled odds ratio, and most of you probably don't know or don't care what a pooled odds ratio is, but it's a combined effect, and it basically tells us that after an abortion, women have an 81% increased risk for mental health problems compared to women who've not had an abortion. So, and the reason I include this slide, I know you can't see it, even the young people in the room won't be able to see it from where you're sitting, but you can see the pattern of effect here. If abortion were not having any systematic impact, then all of those horizontal lines would be centered around the middle vertical line, but they're shifted to that right quadrant. That's showing that's the systematic effect across all those studies. The second meta-analysis that was also published in this paper. I did separate analyses based on the outcome variable, marijuana, suicidal behaviors, alcohol use, depression, anxiety, and the level of increased risk associated with abortion varied from 34% increased risk, which was associated with the anxiety, all the way up to 230% increased risk that we saw with marijuana usage. And then a third meta-analysis, separate pooled odds ratios were conducted based on the comparison group. So if the comparison group in the particular study was just women who didn't have an abortion, or if they carried to term without any indication of the pregnancy intendedness, or the third group looked at unintended pregnancy carried to term specifically, and so regardless of the comparison group, we still had a significant effect, and even with the unintended pregnancy delivered, which is the closest, probably demographically and socially, to women who abort, there was still a 55% increased risk of mental health problems. And for this study, I also calculated the population attributable risk, or the PAR, which is an important statistic derived from the pooled odds ratio, because it allows us to say definitively that nearly 10% of the incidence of all mental health problems is directly attributable to abortion. You get rid of abortion, 10% of the female population will not be experiencing mental health problems. So that's pretty significant and important. There was a recent review published by John Thorpe, who's with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He wrote a paper, a kind of a review paper at the 40th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, and some of the conclusions in his review were the findings are mixed and subject to methodological shortcomings. He also noted that numerous studies from the vast literature indicate harm associated with abortion, and he said the 10% PAR from the Coleman meta-analysis underscores the need for continued research attention, as women who abort experience a disproportionate share of mental health problems. But there are, we know, studies with different conclusions, so we can't ignore that. Beginning with the APA report in 2008 that I mentioned earlier, there have been several narrative reviews on abortion and mental health suggesting that abortion is generally not associated with adverse mental health consequences. However, careful examination of the methodologies of these reviews reveals serious problems, and the results should therefore not be trusted as a basis for professional training protocols or healthcare policy initiatives. I have critiqued several reviews and original studies published in recent years, and they're available on the website for the World Expert Consortium for Abortion Research and Education, which I'll tell you a little bit more about at the end. Basically, I'm desperate to get this information out there and can't rely on the media, so I had to beg my son-in-law, he's like a son now, that's a good thing, but my daughter's husband is a webmaster for Ohio State. When they wanted to know what I wanted for my birthday, I said, I just want a website, please have Brian make me a website, and he did, and it actually has content management capability, so I can easily upload things, and but I will tell you a little bit more about We Care. But one of the purposes is to get information out in a timely fashion when studies are published and picked up by the press, to have a response to that. But today, I'll just highlight a few of the major shortcomings characterizing the most recent review, which was by the Royal College. And it was interesting because they took a slightly different approach. They provided their document online and allowed anybody to critique it. It wasn't just reviewers who were selected, so a lot of people offered feedback, and I think they did incorporate a little bit more than the APA may have, but they were craftier, and it was interesting because some of my friends, read it and said, I think it's pretty good, and I was like, it's not good, it's dangerous, you have to really look at their methodology. And so I just want to point out a few of the glaring problems, and you can read more on the We Care site, read the full critique of it. But it was interesting timing because my meta-analysis was published or actually became available a couple months before this report was available. And the British Journal of Psychiatry is the journal associated with the Royal College of Psychiatrists. So on the one hand, their journal is publishing a paper saying there is a systematic effect here, and then their big narrative review that they put together came to an opposite conclusion. And so I had the opportunity to speak in British Parliament about this time to maybe shake things up or try to a little bit, but it's important. This information is very important in countries where abortion is allowed or it's legal because there's a presumption of mental health benefits that have never been established. We assume abortion is good for women, but where's the evidence? There are no scientific studies that have documented benefits of abortion to women, yet that's the basis for the legal status in so many countries today. That's why I've been to Australia 3 times in the last 3 years, and there's just a real need for the information there, because in many of the states there, it is based on that presumption. It's actually illegal in Queensland, yet 1 out of 3 abortions in Queensland, 1 out of 3 pregnancies end in abortion there, even though it's illegal. So a lot of times the legal status doesn't mean a lot. But let me just point out a little bit about this Royal College review. The bottom line conclusion was that women who terminate unwanted pregnancies do not face increased risk of mental health problems compared to women who give birth. Okay, well, let's look a little closely at what they did here. The most common reasons for them dismissing studies, and they dismissed many studies, were the nebulously defined no usable data. They never tell you what it means the study has no usable data, or less than 90 days follow-up. So every study that reported on women's mental health within a 3-month window after the procedure was kicked out of the review. The latter resulted in elimination of 35 studies in the prevalence, risk factor, and comparison categories. Not surprisingly, many of the eliminated studies revealed adverse post-abortion consequences, of course. Only including studies with extended follow-up minimizes the number of cases of mental health problems identified. As time elapses, healing may naturally occur, other events may moderate the effects, and more confounding variables may be introduced. Finally, and most importantly, this approach misses the serious and more acute episodes that are treated right after the abortion. It's ridiculous. The studies included were not representative of the best available evidence. For example, in the prevalence of disorders category, only 34 studies were retained, including 27 without controls for previous mental health. And if you Google my meta-analysis, you see all over the place. They even said it in their document that I didn't control for prior psych history, but 14 out of 22 of the studies in my meta-analysis had controls, and they only have 7 in theirs out of 34 with controls. So it's ridiculous. And this is another aspect of it. They have different types of studies that are analyzed within this whole report. And so to illustrate how incomplete and misleading the conclusions are, I'll give you one example. I recently identified, this was with the help of my son, 119 studies, 78 since 1990, which was the beginning of their systematic review. That was the year that they used as a starting point, related to risk factors associated with post-abortion health. So there are 119 studies out there, and the RCP conclusions relative to studies addressing the risk factors don't include most of the variables that I mentioned earlier, or that are recognized by abortion providers and the APA. And so based on only 27 studies, they whittled away this literature of, 78 since 90, down to 27, and their conclusion was the most reliable predictor of post-abortion mental health problems is having a history of mental health problems prior to abortion, and a range of other factors produced more mixed results, although there is some suggestion that life events, pressure from a partner to have an abortion, and negative attitudes towards abortion in general and towards a woman's personal experience with abortion may have a negative impact on mental health. So a very tentative conclusion that is just not consistent with what we really know, and where they're on a topic where there is consensus. So let's switch to a happier topic here and look at some of the psychological benefits of motherhood. A number of studies have shown positive psychological characteristics, including an increased sense of control, feelings of serenity, self-esteem, empathy, ego resiliency, and assertiveness associated with motherhood. According to Ellison, who published in 2005, frequent close contact inherent in the daily care of a young child results in expanded maternal brain activity and neural growth. As mothers monitor and attend to children's needs, brain circuits related to empathy are expanded. And here's, I don't know if anybody knows Fleming from the University of Toronto. He found that elevated cortisol levels in new mothers may boost attention, vigilance, and sensitivity. So go look him up if you don't know him. When comparing 248 British women experiencing a planned pregnancy to 182 women experiencing an unplanned pregnancy, DeVe in 2005 found that 87% of women who planned their pregnancy and a pretty close 79% of women who did not reported feeling pleased or overjoyed just prior to delivery. And these were all first-time mothers residing in low socioeconomic areas. In a study by Rokoch in 2004, mothers in their first year of parenting scored significantly lower on a loneliness questionnaire than a subsample of women from the general population, and the subscales included emotional distress, social inadequacy and alienation, interpersonal isolation, and self-isolation. Here's one of my favorite slides. These are booby cookies in case you ever have to go to a shower and want to make some cookies. Easy to make, at least they look pretty easy. If women breastfeed, there are additional benefits as lactation produces the antidepressant chemical oxytocin. Studies suggest lactating mothers are less tense and become bored less easily than their non-lactating peers. The hormonal activity and neural circuitry associated with childbirth and lactation reduces depression and anxiety. Carter and colleagues, leading authorities on oxytocin, have provided scientific evidence suggesting that the brain becomes more receptive to the impact of oxytocin after the first heavy dose during labor and breastfeeding. Hormones of pregnancy and early motherhood apparently facilitate formation of subsequent strong personal relationship bonds. But what about postpartum depression? Well, the incidence rate for postpartum depression is between 3.4% and 11%. However, this form of depression tends to be less serious than major depression, which has been shown to afflict 20% of women after abortion. Moreover, postpartum depression is very unlikely to precipitate suicide. And then kind of looking at some of the studies that have shown that childbirth is protective against death due to suicide. Gisler and colleagues in 2005 reported the annual suicide rate for women of reproductive age, just in general, to be 11.3 per 100,000, whereas the rate was 5.9 in association with birth, and a whopping 34.7 per 100,000 following abortion. Several other studies have revealed even lower rates of suicide in the year following birth when compared to non-postpartum samples. Here are a couple other studies. Schief and Grossman found the postpartum suicide rate was only 1.4, and it was in the United Kingdom. Kleiner and Justin, 84, found the rate was 0.5 per 100,000. England and Wales, in a population-based study, Appleby reported in the British Medical Journal that pregnant women are 1/20th as likely to commit suicide when compared to non-pregnant women of childbearing age. Appleby concluded motherhood seems to protect against suicide. And now I would like to share the story of Stacey Zally, who took her own life in 2002. I know quite a bit about her history, as I served as an expert in a case that her father brought against Stephen Brigham, one of the more notorious abortion providers in the U.S. He's lost his medical license in 3 states. Stacey underwent an abortion in one of his facilities. At age 20, as a result of pressure from her boyfriend, Stacey underwent an abortion. It wasn't just the boyfriend, it was also the boyfriend's father. They transported her there. Shortly afterwards, she asked for psychiatric help, but she ended therapy after only 3 months. Sadly, after several suicide attempts, she hung herself in her room. Her parents didn't know about the abortion until after her death, and in her suicide note, she expressed desire to be reunited with her unborn baby, Brittany Lee. The personal impact of abortion is often profound human suffering, with the most serious cases, like that of Stacey Zally, entailing lives full of potential, needlessly ending long before they should. Continued denial and distortion of the literature by abortion clinic personnel, the media, and professional organizations leaves hundreds of thousands of women untreated like Stacey. Each day, a significant number similarly find the shame, loss, and depression of abortion simply incompatible with life. And I've done estimates for different states that I've been involved with. There probably are approximately 45 to 50 suicide deaths each year in the United States that are the direct result of abortion. This is our grandson, Aiden. Like to look at some of the current challenges surrounding this area of work. The lack of empirically validated treatments has left many women without much hope for relief if they experience post-abortion psychological problems. So an essential future goal is to develop treatment protocols, test them, and publish the results. Also, data collection from significant individuals in women's lives and/or behavioral assessments will enhance efforts to assess the complexity of women's experiences. Researchers need to conduct also more substantive interviews with geographically diverse samples in order to more fully understand the depth and breadth of experiences. Also, short-term studies are potentially misleading because women may suppress their emotions until other life events, such as a birth, trigger a delayed reaction. There's a need for studies following women over many years to more fully understand how abortion experiences intersect with other life events to impact women's quality of life. And I did say earlier that we do have more prospective studies, more long-term studies going out 4 to 6 or 8 years, and the Ferguson studies 25 years, but we really don't have that many that really look across the full course of women's lives. But there was one that was just published in 2010 by, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Dikisa, Slade, and Haywood, and the title was Long-Term Follow-Up of Emotional Experiences After Termination of Pregnancy, Women's Views at Menopause. And the authors reported that many women were still affected by an abortion that had occurred decades earlier. Women discussed menopause as a vulnerable time that had made it increasingly difficult to manage their feelings about their past abortion. As one participant noted, it's only since the menopause has come on that I actually feel really guilty again. I mean, I sometimes sit on my own and I've cried because I feel guilty, but I've noticed that this happens more obviously since I've gone into the menopause. For some women, menopause was associated with the loss of fertility and future opportunities for more children. The authors noted, quote, there's a sense of not being entitled to express sadness at having no further children. Rather, there's a feeling that this right was lost when they had an abortion, and these women should accept and bear their current state without emotion. They somehow deserve this punishment. These were their feelings voiced by the women. The authors concluded the work provides insight into the very long-term consequences of this procedure. Participants stressed the value of being able to discuss the abortion with a neutral third party, to be able to voice some of the thoughts, confusion, and sadness some had carried alone for so long for fear of repercussions or judgment. It's likely that women may benefit from the availability of post-abortion counseling services, not necessarily just in the immediate aftermath, but at different points after the procedure. And here's the newest grandson. He's only 10 weeks, so he's a cutie. His name's Griffin. So We Care to the rescue. I mentioned this organization earlier. Unfortunately, there's an active effort by professional organizations and individual researchers with a political agenda to obscure the scientifically verified truths regarding the potential risks associated with abortion. There's an urgent need to counter the claims in a timely, dispassionate fashion in order to effect change. And so to this end, the consortium was established. It's a 501c3. free thanks to LegalZoom. I don't usually plug companies, but I couldn't really afford a lawyer. It would have been like $5,000 or $6,000, and I was able to do it through LegalZoom for $1,000. So it actually is recognized by the IRS, and the mission is to bring together credentialed scientists with a research program on the physical, psychological, and/or relational effects of abortion on women and those closest to them by adopting a non-religious, non-partisan approach to understanding the implications of abortion. We Care exists to enhance the quality of information, develop strategies for effectively transmitting research findings, and to break down barriers to evidence-based medicine. Here's the website that my son-in-law put together. And these are the affiliates. You may recognize some of the names, especially Angela Lanfranchi. Is she up there? She should be up there. How did I miss her? She's one of them.
She's on your website.
Yeah, oh good. I don't know what happened to that slide, sorry. Good thing Angela's not here. I wouldn't want to hurt her feelings, but she's definitely a part of We Care. What are the services that we provide? So information dissemination, and it's not journal articles just stuck up there. What I've tried to do is create fact sheets that have the information and then like bullet points, and everything is free to download and distribute, and then the references that back up the different topical kinds of overviews. Then we have the research collaboration, hoping to foster more effective international collaboration, consultation. We Care affiliated researchers are available to provide scientifically derived information to individuals and organizations requesting information on the mental, physical, and relational effects of abortion. And then responses to current research activities by posting these news briefs. Professional development. We hope in the future to have online tutorials and seminars, grant writing and publishing workshops, annual conferences, and training of experts for litigation. And we're hoping to foster more dialogue, encourage more media coverage. So please spread the word, and there's the web address for We Care. The risks for post-abortion mental health problems are generally well established in the professional literature. The biggest challenge before us is to convince the mainstream to approach the scientifically derived information objectively, to develop evidence-based laws and service protocols. With knowledge, commitment, effective organization, and compassion, we can assist professionals as they endeavor to empower women to make healthy decisions for themselves and their families. So, and that's it. So thank you very much.